You have no claim upon this house any longer, and you will leave it before the guests finish their wine." The words fell across the grand ballroom of Ravenshade Manor with the cold certainty of a blade. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe stood beneath the towering chandelier, her gloved hands motionless at her sides, while dozens of titled guests watched the humiliation unfold as though it were an evening entertainment arranged for their pleasure. The room had been prepared for celebration. The musicians had finished their final waltz. The silver trays had carried the last glasses of claret. The ladies in silk gowns and pearl necklaces had gathered beneath the warm candlelight, expecting an announcement of reconciliation after years of uncertainty. Instead, they witnessed a woman being erased. Evelyn, the young widow who had waited faithfully through years of war, looked toward the man standing beside the fireplace. Her husband's father, the late Earl of Ravenshade, had died only weeks before. The mourning ribbons on her black dress were still fresh. The estate that had once promised her protection had become the place where she was now being rejected. Across the room stood Lady Araminta Ravenshade, the new Duchess by marriage, her expression calm and almost sympathetic. Almost. The guests laughed quietly when Evelyn did not immediately move. A gentleman near the card tables whispered that perhaps grief had made the widow forget her position. Another woman covered her smile with a lace fan and said that a young bride without a husband was a fragile thing in a house of men. Then Lady Araminta raised a folded document. The paper itself seemed heavier than it should have been. "This," she announced, "is proof that Lady Evelyn has no remaining protection from this family." Evelyn stared at the document, but could not read the words from where she stood. She only saw the seal, a seal that belonged to Ravenshade. The family name that had once been her promise, the family name that was now being used against her. The room fell silent. And in that silence, Evelyn understood that the cruelty she faced that night was only the beginning of a secret buried deep enough to destroy the entire Ravenshade family. Before we return to the beginning of Evelyn Ashcombe's story, tell us where you are listening from today. If you enjoy stories of forgotten voices finding justice, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss another tale from the halls of the Victorian aristocracy. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these stories to life. Now let us return to the night when everything began to fall apart. 3 years earlier, Evelyn had arrived at Ravenshade Manor, not as a prisoner, but as a beloved bride. The estate stood in the northern countryside of England, surrounded by dark woods and fields that disappeared beneath winter fog. Its stone walls had protected generations of the Ravenshade family, yet those same walls had also hidden many truths from the world outside. In those years, Evelyn had believed she understood her place. She was the daughter of a respected but modest country family. She had not inherited great wealth, nor did she possess the powerful connections that many women of her position used as armor. What she carried instead was patience, education, and a quiet dignity that her husband, Lord Julian Ravenshade, had admired. Julian was the heir to the Ravenshade title. Before he left for military service, he had promised Evelyn that when he returned, they would build a life beyond the expectations of society. Their marriage had been arranged according to tradition, but affection had grown within it. He had written letters from distant lands describing the cold mornings, the endless marches, and the small memories that kept him connected to home. Evelyn had kept every letter in a wooden box locked inside her dressing room. Those letters were not simply words. They were proof that someone had once chosen her. But war changed people. When Julian returned, he did not come back as the same young man who had left. He carried the weight of battles he rarely described. He became quieter, more careful, more concerned with duty than happiness. And during those years, another person gained influence inside Ravenshade Manor, Lady Araminta Ravenshade. She had married Julian's father, the old Earl, shortly after the death of his first wife. She understood the world of inheritance better than anyone in the household. She knew that in a family built upon land, titles, and reputation, affection could be easily defeated by documents. Her greatest desire was simple: control. She wanted Ravenshade Manor to belong entirely to her own future children. She wanted the family fortune secured away from Evelyn's influence. She wanted every servant, every account book, and every decision to pass through her hands. At first, she had not attacked openly. She had used smaller methods. A dinner invitation that never reached Evelyn, a letter from Julian that mysteriously arrived days late, a conversation interrupted whenever Evelyn asked about the estate accounts, a suggestion whispered among relatives that perhaps Evelyn was too inexperienced to understand the responsibilities of a noble household. The cruelty was not loud. It was organized. After Julian died unexpectedly during his final campaign, the protection Evelyn believed she had vanished overnight. She had not only lost her husband, she had lost the one person who stood between her and a society that measured women by their usefulness. The mourning period had barely ended when Lady Araminta began changing the household. The servants who once greeted Evelyn warmly became cautious. The rooms assigned to her became smaller. Invitations that had once arrived regularly stopped appearing. The first time Evelyn realized she was truly alone was not when she was insulted. It was when she entered the dining room and found that her place at the table had been removed. No announcement, no argument. Only an empty space where she had once belonged. The servants looked away. Lady Araminta continued eating. That evening, Evelyn did not cry. She simply returned to her room, opened the locked wooden box, and read Julian's final letter again. The handwriting was uneven, written during a difficult journey. He had told her that Ravenshade was not merely stone and land, it was responsibility. He had told her that one day she would understand why certain papers mattered more than people admitted. At the time, Evelyn believed he meant the ordinary matters of an estate. She did not yet know he had been warning her. The following morning, she searched through her late husband's study. The room had been locked since Julian's death. Officially, Lady Araminta claimed that the family solicitor needed time to review the documents inside. But Evelyn noticed something unusual when she passed the door. The lock had been replaced, not repaired, replaced. A small detail. A detail that would have meant nothing to someone else. But Evelyn had lived in Ravenshade Manor long enough to understand its rhythms. Someone had wanted the room sealed quickly. That afternoon, she visited the servant quarters and spoke quietly with Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Ravenshade family for nearly 40 years. Beatrice had always been kind to Evelyn, but kindness was dangerous in a house where information was power. The old housekeeper lowered her voice and glanced toward the corridor. She did not reveal everything. She only said that Lord Julian had spent many nights reviewing old estate records before leaving for war. Then she mentioned a name, Mr. Whitmore, the family solicitor. Before Evelyn could ask more, Beatrice stopped. Not because she had changed her mind, because footsteps were approaching. The truth had almost escaped. Almost. That evening, Evelyn noticed another strange thing. A small envelope hidden behind a loose panel near her bedroom fireplace. It was not addressed to her. It carried Julian's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was only one sentence. "Do not trust any document that arrives after my death." Evelyn read the words again and again. For the first time since losing her husband, she felt something stronger than grief. Suspicion. She knew she could not challenge Lady Araminta openly. A widow accusing a noblewoman without evidence would only destroy her own reputation. The world would not ask whether Evelyn was right. It would ask why she had created a scandal. So she did something different. She watched. She listened. She learned. She began copying small details from the estate ledgers whenever she could access them. She noticed payments that did not match the household expenses. She noticed land income recorded differently from previous years. She noticed that certain pages in the account books appeared newer than the others. It was not enough to prove anything, but it was enough to know she was being deceived. Meanwhile, Lady Araminta prepared her final move. She wanted Evelyn gone before anyone questioned the missing money, and she found a way to make society believe Evelyn had left willingly. A marriage arrangement. Not for Evelyn, against her. The man chosen was a wealthy businessman from London named Mr. Edmund Vale. He was respectable enough to avoid scandal, but old enough to care more about property than affection. Lady Araminta presented the arrangement as an act of generosity. She claimed she had found Evelyn a secure future. In truth, she was trying to remove the widow from Ravenshade while gaining control over what remained of her rights. Evelyn refused. That refusal was the first time in her life she openly opposed the people above her. It was also the moment Lady Araminta stopped pretending to be kind. The invitation to the ballroom gathering arrived 3 days later. Evelyn knew something was wrong, but she attended, because sometimes the only way to discover the truth was to stand exactly where the lie was being performed. And beneath the candles of Ravenshade Manor, surrounded by the same people who once praised her marriage, Evelyn discovered that Lady Araminta had prepared a document that could change everything. The paper was not merely an order to remove her from the house, it was a contract proving that her future had already been sold. And hidden among the signatures was the name of the person who had helped betray her, the one person she never expected. The signature belonged to Lord Julian Ravenshade. For several moments, Evelyn could not move. The candles continued burning. The musicians continued arranging their instruments. The guests continued whispering behind their fans. Yet the world around her seemed to become distant, as though she had been placed beneath deep water and could hear everything only as a faint echo. Her husband's name stood at the bottom of the document, a name that had once promised protection, a name that now appeared to condemn her. Lady Araminta watched carefully from across the ballroom. She had expected shock, she had expected tears, she had expected Evelyn to collapse beneath the weight of betrayal. But Evelyn did not give her that satisfaction. She stepped closer to the paper. The document claimed that Lord Julian had agreed to transfer certain financial interests connected to Ravenshade Manor and had authorized arrangements concerning Evelyn's future after his death. It stated that Edmund Vale would provide her with security, and in exchange, certain claims connected to her late husband's estate would be surrendered. It was written in the careful language of respectable society. That was what made it dangerous. Cruelty hidden beneath politeness was harder to challenge than cruelty spoken aloud. Lady Araminta finally approached. Her voice carried enough concern for the entire room to hear. She told Evelyn that everyone understood grief could make acceptance difficult. She said that no one wished to see a young widow suffer without guidance. She said that Edmund Vale was a gentleman of means who would save her from an uncertain future. The words sounded like kindness. But Evelyn heard the truth beneath them. She was not being offered a future, she was being removed from the past. She looked toward the guests who had once congratulated her marriage. None stepped forward. The same people who had praised Julian's devotion now watched silently while his wife was being traded away like an inconvenient possession. That silence hurt more than the document, because Evelyn realized that many of them did not believe Lady Araminta because they trusted her. They believed her because believing her was easier. A woman without a powerful protector was always expected to be wrong. Evelyn lowered her eyes and studied the signatures. Then she noticed something. The ink, the date, a small inconsistency hidden beneath the formal appearance. Her husband had always written with a particular habit. When signing important documents, Julian pressed firmly on the final stroke of his surname, leaving a deeper mark on the paper. This signature did not have that mark. It looked similar, but it was not the same. For the first time that evening, Evelyn felt the cold grip around her heart loosen slightly. Not because she had won, she had not, but because she knew Julian had not betrayed her. Someone had used his name. Someone had forged the one thing that society would never question, the reputation of a dead man. She needed time. She needed proof. So she bowed her head and accepted the humiliation without revealing what she had discovered. Lady Araminta mistook silence for defeat. The guests mistook it for surrender. But Evelyn knew something they did not. A person who had nothing left to lose could become very patient. That night, after the guests departed and the manor returned to its uneasy quiet, Evelyn walked through the dark corridors alone. The fireplaces had burned low. The warmth of the ballroom was gone. Outside, rain struck the windows, and the wind moved through the old trees surrounding Ravenshade. She entered Julian's locked study. Not through the main door, through a small servant's passage that Beatrice had shown her years earlier when Evelyn had first arrived at the manor. The hidden entrance was narrow and dusty. It was not a place meant for a lady of the house. But Evelyn no longer cared about what places society considered suitable. Inside the study, she found the room almost untouched. Books remained arranged along the shelves. Old maps covered the desk. A small silver clock had stopped beside a stack of papers. The room felt like a memory of a man who had disappeared before he could finish his final conversation. Evelyn searched carefully, not desperately. Desperation created mistakes. She searched like someone who understood that truth often hid in ordinary places. Inside a locked drawer beneath the desk, she found several account records. Most were harmless. But one ledger caught her attention. It recorded payments made from the Ravenshade estate to an account she did not recognize. The amounts were not large enough to attract attention individually, but together they formed a pattern. Money had been leaving the estate for months before Julian died. Someone had been preparing. Someone had known. Before Evelyn could examine further, she heard footsteps outside. She closed the ledger and moved behind the heavy curtains beside the bookshelf. The door opened. Lady Araminta entered with Mr. Whitmore, the family solicitor. Their voices were low. For years, Evelyn had heard that servants carried secrets through kitchens and corridors, but now she understood that the most dangerous secrets were often spoken by those who believed themselves completely safe. Mr. Whitmore sounded uneasy. He said that the arrangement had become more complicated than expected. He said that Evelyn's refusal to accept Edmund Vale's offer created difficulties. Lady Araminta replied that difficulties disappeared when people lost their choices. She reminded the solicitor that Julian had been too honorable to imagine betrayal from his own family. Then she said something that froze Evelyn where she stood. She admitted that the original document was never meant to be questioned because everyone would assume a dead duke had made his final decision. The words were enough. Not everything, but enough. Evelyn had proof that the document was false. She also had proof that Lady Araminta and Mr. Whitmore were involved. Yet before she could reveal herself, another sound came from the hallway. A servant. The door opened slightly. Beatrice stood there. The old housekeeper had clearly heard enough to understand the danger. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Beatrice looked directly toward the curtain where Evelyn stood hidden. Not with surprise, with understanding. The old woman had known, perhaps not everything, but enough to realize that Evelyn needed someone beside her. After Lady Araminta and Mr. Whitmore left, Beatrice entered the room and closed the door. She did not apologize for the years of silence. She simply admitted that she had been afraid. She had watched servants dismissed without references. She had watched families destroyed because one person spoke against those with wealth and titles. But she also confessed something else. Before Julian left for war, he had given her instructions. If anything happened to him, she was to protect a small collection of papers hidden away from the main study. Not because he feared Evelyn, because he feared what others might do to her. For the first time in many months, Evelyn allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Not the fragile hope she had carried as a young bride waiting for someone else to save her. A different kind of hope, one built from knowledge, one built from action. The next morning, Evelyn made a decision that changed the course of her life. She would no longer wait inside Ravenshade Manor for justice to arrive. She would leave, not as a defeated widow, not as a woman thrown away by her husband's family. She would leave as someone gathering strength. With Beatrice's help, she prepared a small amount of money, copied several pages from the ledger, and secured the few belongings that still belonged to her. Before dawn, she stood at the edge of the estate grounds. The manor behind her looked exactly as it always had, beautiful, ancient, untouchable. But Evelyn understood now that walls did not protect families. Truth did. She walked toward the village road with only a small case in her hand. For the first time in her life, she entered the world without a title protecting her. And for the first time in her life, she would discover what she was capable of without one. But unknown to Evelyn, Lady Araminta had already sent word to London. The search for the missing widow had begun. And the person chosen to find her was the same man whose name had appeared on the false contract, Edmund Vale. The village of Wetherby Vale was not the kind of place where Evelyn Ashcombe had imagined beginning a new life. There were no grand gates, no polished carriages waiting beneath stone arches, no servants opening doors before she reached them. There were only narrow streets covered in winter mud, small shops with fogged windows, and the constant sound of ordinary people earning their living beneath the grey English sky. At first, the simplicity unsettled her. For years, every movement inside Ravenshade Manor had been observed. Every word had carried meaning. Every meal had been arranged according to rank and tradition. Now, no one cared who she had been. And strangely, that was a kind of freedom. She rented a small room above a modest inn near the village market. The ceiling was low. The furniture was old. The fireplace struggled to keep away the cold. But when Evelyn closed the door at night, no one could enter without her permission. That small fact mattered more than comfort. The first morning she woke there, she experienced something she had never known as a lady of Ravenshade. She made her own decisions, not because she wanted to reject her old life, but because she had finally discovered that her own hands were capable of building something. The innkeeper, Mrs. Clara Bell, was a practical woman who asked very few questions. She did not ask why a woman dressed in mourning arrived with only one case and no family escort. She did not ask why Evelyn looked like someone who belonged in a manor but slept above a common inn. Instead, she simply said that everyone who paid honestly and behaved respectfully was welcome beneath her roof. It was the first kindness Evelyn received that required nothing in return. Within weeks, Evelyn began helping with the inn's accounts. At first, Mrs. Bell laughed when she saw the young widow correcting numbers written in the old ledger. She said she had never seen anyone look at a list of expenses with such seriousness. But Evelyn had learned something important at Ravenshade. Numbers could reveal what people tried to hide. She helped organize payments, calculate supplies, and record purchases from local merchants. The work was not glamorous. There were no chandeliers, no silk gowns, no conversations about titles. There were only flour deliveries, coal expenses, damaged goods, and honest earnings. Yet each day, Evelyn felt herself becoming stronger. For the first time in her life, she was building value that belonged entirely to her. It was not inherited. It was not granted. It was earned. Meanwhile, London had begun moving against her. Edmund Vale arrived at Ravenshade Manor, exactly as Lady Araminta expected. He was a wealthy businessman with a reputation for discipline. He was not cruel, but he was accustomed to a world where every problem could be solved through money. Lady Araminta welcomed him into the library, the same library where Julian had once studied estate records. She presented Evelyn's disappearance as evidence of instability. She claimed the widow had become overwhelmed by grief and had abandoned her responsibilities. Edmund listened carefully. Unlike many men of his position, he did not immediately accept the story. He noticed something unusual. Lady Araminta spoke about Evelyn as though she were a problem to remove, not a person to protect. He asked why a woman who supposedly had nothing to gain would refuse an advantageous marriage. Lady Araminta answered smoothly. She said some women confused pride with dignity. The sentence remained in Edmund's mind, because he had seen many people with pride, but Evelyn's actions did not look like pride. They looked like someone escaping. Still, he agreed to search for her, not because he wanted to claim her, because he wanted to understand what had truly happened. 3 weeks later, Evelyn discovered that someone had been asking questions in the village. The information came from a young servant at the inn, named Thomas. He was barely 17 and had the habit of speaking before thinking. He told Evelyn that a gentleman from London had visited the market and asked whether a lady matching her description had been seen. Evelyn immediately understood. Lady Araminta had found a way to reach her. The old fear returned, not the fear of poverty, not the fear of losing status, the fear of being dragged back into a place where her voice did not matter. But this time, she did not panic. She reviewed what she knew. Edmund Vale had been chosen as part of the plan. The false document connected him to the scheme, but she did not know whether he was a willing participant or simply another person being used. That uncertainty mattered. Because Evelyn had learned that truth could not be built on assumptions, it required evidence, so she made a choice. She would not run again. She would find out who Edmund Vale truly was. A few days later, she travelled to a nearby market town where merchants from London often stopped. She had learned that Mr. Vale's company purchased several properties in the area. Instead of hiding, she approached one of his former business associates. She introduced herself not as Lady Evelyn Ravenshade, only as Evelyn Ashcombe. The name felt different without a title attached, less powerful. but more honest. The merchant recognized the surname. He told her something unexpected. Edmund Vale had recently questioned several financial records connected to Ravenshade. He had not asked how to take Evelyn's rights. He had asked why the accounts appeared incomplete. Evelyn listened carefully. A small possibility appeared. Perhaps Edmund was not the final enemy. Perhaps he was another person standing too close to the fire to see who had started it. That evening, Evelyn wrote a letter. Not a desperate plea, not an accusation, a request for a meeting. She knew the risk. If Edmund truly worked with Lady Araminta, she would reveal her location. But if he did not, he might be the first person with enough influence to challenge the lie publicly. For the first time since leaving Ravenshade, Evelyn chose action over hiding, and that decision changed everything. The meeting took place at a quiet corner of a London coffee house several days later. Edmund Vale arrived expecting to find a frightened widow. Instead, he found a woman who placed copied account pages on the table before speaking. She did not ask him for sympathy. She asked him to examine the figures. He looked at the papers, then he looked at her, and slowly his expression changed. Because he recognized the same thing she had discovered. The money missing from Ravenshade was not random. It had been moved carefully, repeatedly, and someone had been preparing for Julian's death long before the war ended. Edmund quietly admitted that he had never seen the original contract. Only a copy provided by Lady Araminta. Evelyn felt the pieces begin to connect. The forged document, the missing funds, the sealed study, the hidden instructions from Julian. But before they could continue, Edmund received a message delivered by his clerk. A message from Ravenshade Manor. Lady Araminta had learned that he had met Evelyn, and she had written only one sentence. If you continue helping her, you will discover exactly what happened to Lord Julian. Edmund read the words twice, then he folded the paper. For the first time, he understood that he was not investigating a family dispute. He was standing at the edge of a much larger deception. And somewhere inside Ravenshade Manor, the person who had helped create the lie was preparing the next move. The next time Evelyn returned to that house, she would not return as a discarded widow. She would return carrying the evidence that could bring an entire family to judgment. But before that day came, Evelyn understood that evidence alone would not be enough. In the world she had once belonged to, truth did not always win, simply because it was true. It needed witnesses. It needed courage. It needed to survive the voices of people who had spent years protecting their own comfort. So she and Edmund began gathering what remained hidden. Their first journey was not to Ravenshade Manor. It was to the office of Mr. Whitmore. The solicitor had served the Ravenshade family for decades, and Evelyn knew that confronting him directly would only make him destroy whatever remained. Instead, Edmund arranged a meeting under the appearance of reviewing ordinary business matters. The office was small compared with the grandeur of Ravenshade, but every shelf carried the weight of other families' secrets. Documents filled the cabinets. Ledgers rested behind locked doors. A single gas lamp illuminated the room with a weak yellow glow. When Mr. Whitmore entered, he appeared calm, too calm. He greeted Edmund politely and avoided looking directly at Evelyn. That small reaction told her more than an apology could have. He knew exactly who she was. Evelyn placed the copied account pages on the desk. She did not accuse him. She asked questions. That was something she had learned during her time away from Ravenshade. Anger could be dismissed. Questions were harder to escape. She asked why estate payments had been redirected. She asked why the document concerning her future had been prepared before Julian's death. She asked why the original papers had never been shown to her. With every question, Mr. Whitmore's confidence weakened. Finally, he admitted that Lady Araminta had pressured him. He claimed he had only prepared documents. He claimed he had not known how far she intended to go. But Evelyn noticed he avoided one subject, Julian. She asked what happened during the final weeks before Julian left for war. The room became silent. Mr. Whitmore looked toward the window. Then he confessed something he had hidden for years. Before leaving England, Julian had visited him privately. Julian had suspected that money was disappearing from the estate. He had not accused anyone because he wanted proof before damaging his own family's name. He had asked the solicitor to prepare a sealed collection of documents that would only be opened if he did not return. Evelyn felt her hands tighten. A sealed collection. Another piece of the truth. She asked where those papers were. Mr. Whitmore hesitated. Then he admitted they had vanished. Not lost, taken. The implication was clear. Someone had entered the solicitor's records after Julian's death. Someone had known exactly what to remove. When Evelyn left the office, she did not feel victorious. She felt the sadness of realizing how many people had known something was wrong and had remained silent. The betrayal was no longer one woman's ambition. It was a chain of fear. That evening, she returned to the small house she rented near the market. She sat beside the fire and looked at the simple room around her. Months earlier, she would have thought this place represented everything she had lost. Now she understood differently. The room represented everything she had gained: independence, clarity, a voice of her own. For the first time in her life, she was not fighting because someone powerful told her what she deserved. She was fighting because she knew it herself. The next morning, Beatrice sent a message. The old housekeeper had remained at Ravenshade Manor despite Lady Araminta's growing suspicion. She had stayed because leaving would mean abandoning the last remaining connection to Julian's truth. The message contained only a few words. The garden wall. The old stone beneath the rose arch. Evelyn immediately understood. The garden had always been the one place at Ravenshade where conversations could happen without servants listening and without family members performing for society. It was where Julian had first told her that he admired her courage. It was where they had once imagined a future. And now, it appeared to hold another secret. Evelyn returned to Ravenshade Manor after 3 years of absence, not through the grand entrance, through the same servant's path she had taken when she left. The difference was that she no longer walked with her head lowered. The grounds looked unchanged. The trees were bare. The winter air was sharp. The manor stood proudly against the grey sky, but Evelyn no longer felt small beside it. She entered the garden alone. The rose arch was covered in frost. Beneath it, hidden between old stones, she found a small metal container. Inside was not the missing will. Not yet. Instead, there was a letter, Julian's handwriting. Her breath caught. The letter was dated shortly before his departure. He had written that he feared someone close to the family was attempting to gain control of Ravenshade. He had written that he could not openly accuse anyone without proof, but he had prepared a record of every suspicious transaction. At the bottom of the letter was one final instruction: trust the person who stayed when everyone else protected themselves. Evelyn knew immediately who he meant: Beatrice. But the letter contained one more detail: a name, a person who had helped Julian investigate the missing funds, a person who had disappeared shortly after Julian's death, a former estate accountant named Henry Bell. Evelyn recognized the surname, the same surname as the innkeeper who had given her shelter, Mrs. Clara Bell. The connection was impossible to ignore. When Evelyn returned to the inn, she found Clara waiting. The older woman did not appear surprised. She simply placed a small bundle of papers on the table. She admitted that Henry Bell had been her brother. He had discovered irregularities in Ravenshade's accounts and had attempted to bring the evidence forward. But after Julian's death, he had been accused of theft. His reputation destroyed. His employment ended. He left England in shame. Before leaving, he had entrusted Clara with copies of the records, because he believed that one day someone would need them. Evelyn opened the papers carefully. The evidence was finally beginning to form a complete picture: the missing money, the forged document, the false arrangement with Edmund Vale, the people who had been silenced. Everything pointed toward one final confrontation. But Lady Araminta was not waiting passively. By the time Evelyn and Edmund prepared their return to Ravenshade, invitations had already been sent across the county. A grand gathering was announced, a celebration meant to prove that Ravenshade remained untouched by scandal. Lady Araminta intended to present Edmund Vale as the future husband of Evelyn Ashcombe before the highest circles of society. She believed public approval would make the lie permanent. She did not know that Evelyn was returning with the very truth she had tried to bury. And she did not know that the man standing beside Evelyn was no longer the person she had expected to control. The stage was being prepared. The same ballroom where Evelyn had once been humiliated would soon become the place where every hidden decision would be judged. But before the doors opened and the guests arrived, one final piece of evidence was still missing: the original document that proved Julian's true intentions. And without it, Lady Araminta could still claim that every other paper was nothing more than the desperate words of a widow. The final battle would not begin with an accusation, it would begin with a question: who had taken the original will of Ravenshade? The answer came from the one place no one had thought to search: not the locked study, not the solicitor's office, not the rooms of those who had the most to gain. It had been hidden among the ordinary things of the household. Beatrice returned to Ravenshade before dawn, carrying a small wooden sewing box that had belonged to the former housekeeper. She found Evelyn and Edmund waiting in the garden, where the frost still covered the stone paths. The old woman placed the box between them. Inside were spools of thread, worn needles, and a folded piece of cloth. Nothing that would attract attention. Nothing that a person searching for valuable papers would consider important. But beneath the cloth was a narrow compartment. Beatrice explained that Julian had trusted her because she was invisible to those who believed themselves powerful. People watched the solicitor. They watched the family. They watched the guests. They never watched the woman who repaired their clothes. Inside the hidden compartment was a small key. Not a document. Not proof. A key. Evelyn held it carefully, remembering Julian's warning that truth often survived in places people ignored. Beatrice told her that after Julian's death, she had seen Lady Araminta searching the study. She had seen Mr. Whitmore carrying away several papers. But there had been one moment when Lady Araminta looked frightened. Not angry, not confident, frightened. Because she could not find everything. One paper had escaped her. Beatrice had suspected that Julian had prepared another hiding place, one only someone who understood the manor's oldest secrets would know. Together, they returned to the library. The room had changed since Evelyn's last visit. New furniture had been added. Old portraits had been moved. The family wanted the house to appear untouched, while quietly rewriting everything inside it. But the library still carried traces of the past. Evelyn studied the shelves. She remembered Julian spending long evenings there, not reading for pleasure, but searching through records. Then she noticed the old grandfather clock near the fireplace. It had not moved in decades. The key fit a small opening behind the wooden panel. A hidden drawer slid forward. Inside rested a sealed envelope. The original will. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence was not empty. It carried the weight of everything Evelyn had endured. The ballroom humiliation, the forced marriage arrangement, the loss of her home, the months when society believed she had no voice. All of it had led to this moment. But Evelyn did not open the envelope immediately. She understood that the paper inside was powerful, and powerful things required care. She looked at Edmund, she looked at Beatrice, then she broke the seal. The words inside confirmed what Julian had suspected. He had never intended for Evelyn to be removed from Ravenshade. He had left instructions protecting her position and ensuring that the estate could not be controlled by anyone who placed personal ambition above family responsibility. More importantly, he had named the people he trusted to reveal the truth if anything happened to him: Beatrice, Henry Bell, and Evelyn herself. Not because she was a noblewoman, not because she was his wife, because Julian believed she possessed the strength to stand when others chose silence. For the first time since his death, Evelyn allowed herself to grieve not only for the husband she lost, but for the years stolen from her by deception. Then she folded the document. The grief remained, but it no longer controlled her. Outside, the first guests began arriving for Lady Araminta's gathering. Carriages moved along the road toward Ravenshade Manor. The same people who had watched Evelyn fall were returning to witness what they believed would be another victory for the family's reputation. They did not know they were arriving for something else, a judgment. And this time, Evelyn would not stand alone beneath the chandelier. The carriages arrived one after another beneath the stone entrance of Ravenshade Manor. The guests stepped down, carrying the same confidence they had always carried. They believed the house belonged to people like them. They believed titles could silence questions. They believed a woman who had once been sent away through the servants' entrance would never return through the front doors. Inside the ballroom, Lady Araminta stood beneath the chandelier, wearing a deep emerald gown. The room had been arranged carefully. Every detail had been chosen to create an image of stability. The silver trays, the polished floors, the portraits of ancestors watching from the walls. Everything was designed to remind the guests that Ravenshade was powerful. But power built upon a lie was more fragile than anyone understood. Edmund arrived first. Lady Araminta greeted him with satisfaction. She believed his presence meant victory. She believed that once he publicly accepted the arrangement, Evelyn's remaining objections would disappear beneath the weight of society's approval. She did not notice that Edmund no longer looked at her with uncertainty. He looked at her with disappointment. That was far more dangerous. Because fear could be controlled, disappointment could not. The musicians began playing. Guests gathered in small groups. Whispers moved through the ballroom. They spoke of Evelyn's disappearance. They spoke of her supposed inability to accept her changed position. They spoke as though her suffering had been a social inconvenience rather than a personal tragedy. Then the doors opened. The room changed. Evelyn Ashcombe entered. Not in the faded mourning clothes they expected, not as a desperate widow asking for forgiveness. She wore a simple but elegant dark blue gown. There were no excessive jewels, no attempt to compete with Lady Araminta. She did not need decoration. Her confidence was enough. The conversation slowly disappeared. One by one, the guests turned toward her. The same guests who had laughed months earlier. The same guests who had watched her humiliation. The same guests who had decided silence was safer than truth. This time, they did not know what to say. Lady Araminta recovered first. She smiled, a careful smile, the kind used by people who had spent years pretending not to feel threatened. She asked Evelyn whether she had returned to create another scene. The question was designed for the audience. She wanted Evelyn to appear emotional, unreasonable, a grieving woman unable to accept reality. But Evelyn had prepared for that. She looked around the ballroom before answering. She saw the faces watching her. Then she spoke calmly. She said she had not returned to create a scene. She had returned because a scene had been created around her 3 years ago. A scene where a dead man's name was used, a widow's reputation was damaged, and a family's honor was protected by hiding the truth. The room became silent. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence where everyone understood that something irreversible had begun. Lady Araminta attempted to interrupt. She said Evelyn had no evidence. She said grief could make people misunderstand documents. She said anyone could produce old papers and claim they revealed secrets. Then Evelyn turned toward Edmund. He stepped forward. This was the moment Lady Araminta had not expected. The man she thought she had chosen as part of her plan was now standing against her. Edmund told the guests that he had originally been approached with a document claiming to represent Julian Ravenshade's final wishes. But after examining the estate accounts, he had discovered inconsistencies. He explained that the financial records provided to him did not match the true movement of Ravenshade's money. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Because accusations were one thing, numbers were another. Money left a trail. Then Beatrice entered. The elderly housekeeper walked slowly across the ballroom. Many guests recognized her. Few had ever considered her important. That was exactly why she had survived. Lady Araminta's expression changed when she saw her. For the first time that evening, confidence disappeared. Beatrice carried no title, no wealth, no influence among society. But she carried something more valuable, memory. She told the room that she had served Ravenshade Manor for nearly 40 years. She told them she had seen Lord Julian question the estate accounts before he left. She told them he had feared betrayal. Then she revealed that he had prepared documents to protect Evelyn. A murmur spread through the guests. Lady Araminta demanded proof, not because she believed Beatrice was lying, because she knew the proof existed. Evelyn stepped forward. She held the sealed document in her hands, the original will of Ravenshade. The paper that had disappeared, the paper that had been hidden because it could not be controlled. Lady Araminta stared at it. For the first time, Evelyn saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not the fear of losing money, the fear of losing the story she had created. The seal was broken before the entire room, and as the document was read aloud, every carefully arranged lie began to collapse. Julian had never sold Evelyn's future. He had never approved Edmund Vale's arrangement. He had never intended for Lady Araminta to control the estate without accountability. The ballroom that had once witnessed Evelyn's humiliation now witnessed her restoration, but the greatest revelation had not yet arrived. Because among Julian's final instructions was a statement that changed the entire meaning of the inheritance dispute. The estate was not simply protected for Evelyn, it was protected from anyone who had attempted to misuse it, including the person who had spent years pretending to defend the Ravenshade name. Lady Araminta. Lady Araminta. The name remained in the air longer than anyone expected. No one immediately spoke, not because they were confused, because they were calculating. Every person in that ballroom understood what such a revelation meant. In their world, reputation was not merely a personal possession, it was currency. A family name could open doors, secure marriages, protect fortunes, and determine whether society welcomed someone or quietly erased them. And now the woman who had spent years defending the Ravenshade name had become the person accused of damaging it. Lady Araminta stepped forward. For a brief moment, Evelyn saw the woman she had known before all of this began. Not the cold figure who had removed her from the household. Not the strategist who had arranged documents and whispers. A woman who realized that the walls she had built around herself were finally collapsing. Then the expression disappeared. Lady Araminta lifted her chin and denied everything. She said the document could have been altered. She said Julian had been too trusting. She said Evelyn had manipulated Edmund and Beatrice because she wanted revenge after losing her position. The accusation was carefully chosen. It was not meant to prove innocence. It was meant to create doubt, and for a moment, doubt moved through the room, because that was how Lady Araminta had always survived. She did not need everyone to believe her. She only needed enough people to hesitate. But Evelyn had learned something during the months she lived away from Ravenshade. Truth did not need to shout. It needed to remain standing. She turned toward Mr. Whitmore, who had remained near the edge of the ballroom. The solicitor looked older than he had before. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. Evelyn asked him a simple question, whether he had personally seen Lord Julian sign the document that had been used against her. The room turned toward him. Mr. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. Everyone understood. His silence was an answer. Lady Araminta immediately accused him of weakness. She said he was protecting himself now that he feared consequences. But the solicitor did something unexpected. He stepped away from her. For years, he had protected the family name because he believed that was his duty. But standing there, surrounded by the people who had witnessed Evelyn's humiliation, he finally understood that protecting a name by hiding wrongdoing only destroyed the meaning of that name. He admitted that the document presented at Ravenshade was not the original. He admitted that Lady Araminta had instructed him to prepare papers after Julian's death. He admitted that he had ignored warning signs because he convinced himself he was only following orders. The confession changed the atmosphere immediately. The guests no longer watched Evelyn as a widow creating trouble. They watched Lady Araminta as a woman who had been exposed. But the final blow did not come from the people with titles. It came from the person who had spent years unseen. Beatrice stepped forward again. Her voice was quiet, almost too quiet for such a large room. She told them about the night Lady Araminta searched Julian's study. She told them about the missing papers. She told them about the servants who had been dismissed after asking questions. She did not exaggerate. She did not insult. She simply remembered, and that made her words impossible to dismiss. The guests who once laughed at Evelyn now looked uncomfortable. Some avoided her eyes. Others whispered apologies too quietly for anyone to hear. Evelyn noticed, and strangely, she felt no satisfaction. The moment she had imagined during her darkest nights had never been about watching people feel ashamed. It had been about no longer feeling powerless. That was the victory, not their embarrassment, her freedom. Lady Araminta looked around the room. She saw the people who once admired her beginning to distance themselves. She saw the doors of society slowly closing. The same doors she had used as weapons against Evelyn. Her voice became softer. She approached Evelyn, and for the first time, abandoned her pride. She said she had only done what she believed was necessary. She said she feared losing everything. She said she had protected the estate because she believed Evelyn was too young and inexperienced to understand responsibility. It was not a true apology. It was an explanation, and Evelyn recognized the difference. Years earlier, she would have accepted those words because she desperately wanted peace. But she was not the same woman who had stood beneath that chandelier waiting for someone else to defend her. She looked at Lady Araminta and answered calmly. She said she understood fear, she understood loss, she understood the desire to protect what one loved. But she would never understand destroying another person's life to preserve her own comfort. The ballroom remained silent. Lady Araminta lowered her eyes. For the first time, there was no argument left. The consequences came quickly after that night. The family solicitor began the process of correcting the estate records. The false arrangement with Edmund Vale was withdrawn. The missing funds were traced through the accounts that Henry Bell had preserved. Lady Araminta was not sent away in disgrace by force. Instead, she experienced something far more painful in her world. She became unwelcome. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended when she entered a room. People who once competed for her attention suddenly remembered other obligations. The society she had trusted abandoned her as easily as it had once abandoned Evelyn. But Evelyn did not return to Ravenshade simply to reclaim a title. She returned because she had learned the value of a home. She reopened the household accounts. She restored the servants who had been dismissed unfairly. She ensured that Beatrice was treated not as an employee who had served the family, but as someone who had protected its honor when others failed. And when she entered Julian's study again, she did not feel like a woman searching for answers. She felt like the person he had believed she could become. Months later, Edmund visited Ravenshade Manor. Their relationship had changed slowly, not through promises made in moments of emotion, through respect, through honesty, through seeing each other when neither had anything to gain. He told Evelyn that he had once thought wealth gave people control over their lives. Now he understood that character mattered more. Evelyn smiled. She told him she had once believed losing Ravenshade meant losing everything. Now she knew some losses were the beginning of finding oneself. Outside, the garden that had once hidden Julian's final secret began to bloom again. The same place where Evelyn had discovered betrayal became the place where she found peace. And on a quiet winter morning, she walked beneath the old rose arch, carrying a small letter from Julian, not as a reminder of what she had lost, but as a reminder of what she had survived. Because the greatest inheritance she received was not the estate, it was the courage to decide her own future. A person's worth was never measured by the door that closed against them, but by the strength with which they built the one that opened next. If this story of Evelyn Ashcombe's journey from rejection to justice touched your heart, remember to like, subscribe, and support the channel, so more forgotten voices from the past can be brought back into the light. But the story of Ravenshade was not finished. The truth had been revealed, yet Evelyn knew that justice was not complete simply because a room full of powerful people had finally heard the truth. A reputation damaged over years could not be repaired in one evening. A life stolen could not be returned by one document. And there was still one question that remained unanswered. What would happen when the applause faded and the guests returned to their own estates? For Evelyn, that question mattered more than the victory itself. In the weeks after the gathering, Ravenshade Manor entered a period of uncomfortable change. The house remained beautiful. The gardens remained carefully maintained. The portraits of former Ravenshade generations still watched from the walls. But the atmosphere had changed. For years, the manor had been governed by fear disguised as tradition. Now, the household was being rebuilt upon something different. Responsibility. Evelyn did not remove every person who had failed her. That would have been easy. It would have been satisfying. But she had learned that power revealed character more clearly than hardship ever could. Some servants who had remained silent came to her privately. They apologized. They admitted that they had seen signs of wrongdoing but feared losing their positions. Evelyn listened to them. She understood fear. She had lived beneath it. But she also told them that silence had consequences. A household could not be honorable if everyone protected themselves while one person suffered. Those words spread through Ravenshade, not as a command, as a reminder. The servants who once whispered behind closed doors began speaking openly again. The kitchen, once a place where rumors traveled because people had no other way to protect themselves, became a place where information could be shared honestly. Beatrice watched the transformation quietly. One evening, as she arranged letters in the household office, she told Evelyn that the manor felt different, not richer. Not more impressive, different. Evelyn asked what she meant. The old housekeeper smiled and said that for many years Ravenshade had belonged to the people who owned it. Now, perhaps for the first time, it belonged to the people who cared for it. Evelyn carried those words with her, because she knew Beatrice was right. A home was not created by stone walls or inherited names. It was created by the people who refused to let cruelty become normal. Meanwhile, Lady Araminta remained at a smaller residence outside London. The woman who once controlled every conversation now lived in quiet isolation. Some expected Evelyn to enjoy her downfall, but she did not. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was familiar. Lady Araminta requested one final meeting. Evelyn hesitated before accepting, not because she feared her, because she no longer needed anything from her. That was the greatest difference between them. Years earlier, Evelyn had needed Lady Araminta's approval. She had needed the family's acceptance. She had needed society to admit that she belonged. Now, she needed none of those things. The meeting took place in a small sitting room away from the grandeur of Ravenshade. Lady Araminta looked older, not weak, not helpless, but tired. She admitted that she had been wrong. Not completely, not gracefully, but enough. She said she had spent her life believing security came from controlling everything around her. She had feared losing the estate, feared losing status, feared becoming irrelevant, and in trying to prevent those things, she had destroyed the very respect she wanted to protect. Evelyn listened, then she answered carefully. She told Lady Araminta that understanding the reason behind a wrong did not erase the wrong itself. Forgiveness was not the same as pretending nothing happened. Lady Araminta lowered her eyes. She asked whether Evelyn hated her. The answer surprised her. Evelyn said no, because hatred would mean Lady Araminta still controlled a part of her life, and Evelyn had spent too long fighting to become free. The two women never became close. They never rebuilt the relationship that had been broken, but for the first time, they faced each other without lies. And sometimes, that was the only peace that could exist between two people. As seasons changed, Ravenshade also changed. Evelyn used part of the estate income to improve conditions for the workers and their families. She supported local businesses in the nearby village. She created a small account to help women who had been left without support after losing husbands or relatives. She knew too well how quickly society could discard a woman once she no longer had a man standing beside her. The work did not make her famous. It did not place her name in newspapers. She preferred that. She had spent enough time watching people perform goodness for appearances. She wanted actions that remained after people stopped watching. Years later, visitors who came to Ravenshade often remarked that the estate felt warmer than other grand houses. They could not explain why. Perhaps it was because the fireplaces burned brighter. Perhaps it was because the servants no longer moved with fear. Perhaps it was because the woman who lived there had once known what it meant to be shut outside, and she never forgot. One winter evening, Evelyn stood beneath the rose arch, where Julian's final secret had been hidden. The garden was quiet. The same cold air that once surrounded her when she left Ravenshade now touched her face gently. She held no anger toward the past, only understanding. Julian's memory remained with her, not as a chain binding her to what had been lost, but as a reminder of the person he believed she could become. A person who could stand alone, a person who could choose, a person who could rebuild. The manor behind her was no longer a place where she waited for someone else to decide her fate. It was her home. And the woman who had once been told she had no place there had become the person who decided what that place would become. Because justice was not only about exposing those who caused harm. It was also about proving that they could not define the future of the person they tried to break. The years that followed did not erase the memory of what happened at Ravenshade. They changed the meaning of it. There were still people who remembered the scandal before they remembered the truth. There were still whispers among certain circles in London that a woman could not truly restore a family name because she had once been publicly rejected by it. Evelyn accepted that. She had learned that reputation was not rebuilt by forcing people to speak differently. It was rebuilt by living differently for long enough that their words became impossible to maintain. One spring morning, a young woman arrived at Ravenshade Manor seeking assistance. She was the daughter of a small landowner who had died, leaving behind debts and a family that had quickly forgotten their promises. She came expecting to be judged. Instead, Evelyn invited her inside. The young woman confessed that she had nowhere else to go. She said she feared becoming a burden. Evelyn understood those words immediately. She remembered standing outside Ravenshade with a small case in her hand, believing the world had closed every door before she had even reached them. So she offered the young woman work managing household records. Not charity, opportunity. That distinction mattered. Because Evelyn knew the most painful thing was not always losing money. Sometimes it was losing the feeling that one still had value. The first time in her life, Evelyn realized that her suffering had not only been something to survive, it had become something she could use to protect others. That summer, Edmund Vale returned to Ravenshade. Their connection had grown quietly over time. There had been no dramatic declarations before crowds. No promises made for the sake of appearances, only small moments. Conversations in the library, walks through the garden, disagreements where neither person needed to win. He had once approached Evelyn as part of a transaction arranged by others. Now he stood beside her because he respected the woman she had become. During one evening walk beneath the trees, Edmund asked whether she ever missed the life she had lost. The question surprised her, because years earlier she would have answered differently. She would have said she missed the security, the certainty, the place she believed she had. But now she looked toward Ravenshade Manor, glowing in the distance. She said she missed the innocence of believing people always meant what they promised. Then she smiled. But she did not miss the woman she had been before. Edmund understood, because he had also changed. He had entered Evelyn's story believing wealth could solve problems. He left it understanding that some debts could only be repaid through honesty. Their future was not built upon rescue, it was built upon equality. And that was something Evelyn valued more than any title. Many years later, visitors would still tell the story of the Ravenshade widow. Some would focus on the false document. Some would remember the public confrontation. Some would remember the downfall of Lady Araminta. But the people who truly understood the story remembered something quieter. They remembered that a woman who had been told she had no power learned to create her own. They remembered that the servants who had once lowered their eyes eventually walked through Ravenshade with dignity. They remembered that a house once ruled by fear became a place where people could speak the truth. And they remembered Evelyn standing beneath the chandelier where she had once been humiliated, not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone who had already won the only victory that mattered. She had become impossible to erase. On a cold winter evening, many years after the night she was ordered to leave, Evelyn sat beside the fireplace in the same manner that had once rejected her. A small wooden box rested on the table beside her. Inside were Julian's letters, the documents that had saved her, and the simple reminder that had guided her through every difficult season. The truth could be delayed. It could be hidden. It could be ignored. But it could not be destroyed forever. Outside, snow covered the grounds of Ravenshade. Inside, the fire continued burning. And for the first time, the warmth of that house belonged not to a title, not to a family name, and not to the approval of society. It belonged to the woman who had fought to make it a home. Because the greatest inheritance was never the land beneath a person's feet. It was the courage to stand upon it. If this story of Evelyn Ashcombe's journey from betrayal to justice moved you, remember to like, subscribe, and support the channel so more forgotten voices from history can be heard. The story of Ravenshade was no longer told as a tale of a woman who had been rescued. It was remembered as the story of a woman who discovered that she had been capable of saving herself all along. In the years that followed, Evelyn kept Julian's letters in the same wooden box where she had once hidden them during her darkest days. She never placed them on display. She never used them as proof of her importance. Some memories were not meant for society. Some were meant only for the heart. The servants who remained at Ravenshade often noticed that Evelyn would walk through the old corridors alone in the evenings. She would pause near the library door, touch the worn wooden frame, and remember the night she entered that room searching for answers. She remembered the woman she had been then, a widow without protection, a wife without a voice. A person who believed losing her place in a grand house meant losing her place in the world, but the years had taught her otherwise. A person could lose a title, a person could lose wealth, a person could lose the approval of those who once gathered around them, but dignity was not something another person could inherit, purchase, or steal. It was something a person carried. One autumn afternoon, Evelyn visited the village market where she had once lived above the small inn. The streets were busier than before. Merchants called out their goods. Children ran between the shops. Farmers delivered produce from nearby fields. She stopped outside the inn and remembered the first night she slept there. The room had been cold. The furniture had been plain. The future had seemed uncertain. Yet that place had given her something Ravenshade had failed to give her. A chance to discover herself. Mrs. Clara Bell was older now, but she still greeted Evelyn with the same practical warmth. They sat together beside the window, drinking tea while rain fell outside. Clara told her that many people in the village still spoke of the day Evelyn arrived. They had expected a frightened noblewoman who would leave as soon as life became difficult. Instead, they watched her work. They watched her learn. They watched her rebuild. Evelyn smiled and said that perhaps she had needed to lose everything familiar before she could understand what truly belonged to her. Clara replied that sometimes a locked door did not appear to keep someone out. Sometimes it existed to force them to find another way through. Evelyn carried those words back to Ravenshade. That winter, the manor hosted another gathering. Not the kind Lady Araminta had arranged years before. There were no hidden intentions, no documents prepared in secret, no smiles covering threats. The guests came because they respected the woman who had restored the estate. They came because Ravenshade had become known not for its wealth, but for its fairness. When Evelyn entered the ballroom that evening, she noticed the chandelier above her, the same chandelier beneath which she had once stood while everyone watched her humiliation. For a brief moment, the memory returned, the laughter, the whispers, the feeling of being completely alone. Then she looked around. The room was different, not because the walls had changed, because she had. The place that once represented her rejection now represented her survival. Edmund joined her near the edge of the room. He asked whether she was thinking about the past. Evelyn answered honestly, she was, but not with pain, with gratitude. Because if that night had never happened, she might never have discovered the strength that had always been inside her. The music began. Guests moved across the floor. The fire burned warmly against the winter darkness outside. And Evelyn understood something she had not understood when she first arrived at Ravenshade as a young bride. A person's life was not defined by the moment they were pushed away. It was defined by what they built after. The house that had once closed its doors against her had become the place where she opened doors for others. The name that had once been used to silence her had become a name associated with compassion. The inheritance that others fought to possess had become a responsibility she carried with care. And long after the whispers of Lady Araminta's betrayal faded, one truth remained. Evelyn Ashcombe had not reclaimed Ravenshade because she proved she belonged there. She reclaimed it because she proved that no one had the power to decide where she belonged. The fire continued burning through the winter night. The rain continued falling beyond the windows. And within the walls of Ravenshade Manor, a woman who had once been sent away as though she had nothing left, stood exactly where she was always meant to. Stand, not beneath someone else's protection, not behind someone else's name, but entirely within her own. That realization did not arrive as a grand announcement. It arrived quietly, in the small decisions made each morning. In the letters she answered herself, instead of leaving them for others. In the accounts she reviewed not because she feared betrayal, but because she understood responsibility. In the way young women who visited Ravenshade no longer lowered their voices when speaking about their futures. Evelyn had once believed power belonged to those who inherited it. Now she knew power also belonged to those who learned how to use what they had been given. One final challenge came years later, when a distant relative of the Ravenshade family attempted to question the changes Evelyn had made. Lord Frederick Ravenshade arrived from London, carrying the confidence of someone who believed old names still carried unquestionable authority. He was not a villain like Lady Araminta. That made him more difficult. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply assumed. During a meeting in the library, he suggested that the estate had become too focused on charity and too little focused on preserving traditional expectations. He reminded Evelyn that families like Ravenshade had survived for generations because they understood the importance of appearances. Evelyn listened patiently. Years earlier, she might have felt intimidated by his title. She might have searched for the right words to defend herself. Now she simply opened the estate records. She showed him the improvements made through careful management, the stronger accounts, the repaired properties, the increased stability of the workers' homes. She explained that tradition had never been the problem. The problem was using tradition as an excuse to avoid responsibility. Lord Frederick studied the documents in silence. For once, there was no argument ready, because Evelyn was no longer defending herself emotionally. She was presenting facts. The same skill she had developed when she first copied the hidden accounts in Ravenshade. The same patience that had helped her survive. After a long pause, Lord Frederick admitted that he had underestimated her. Evelyn accepted the acknowledgement, but did not seek his approval. She had learned long ago that respect given only after victory was not the same as kindness offered before judgment. Later that evening, she walked through the garden. The rose arch stood exactly where Julian's secret had been hidden. The flowers had grown thicker over the years. Nature had covered the place where fear once lived. She thought about all the versions of herself that had existed inside those walls. The young bride who arrived, believing love would protect her. The widow who stood alone while strangers laughed. The woman who left, with nothing except courage. And the woman who returned, carrying the truth. They were all the same person. None of them had been weak. Some had simply not yet discovered their strength. When Edmund joined her, he asked whether she ever wondered what would have happened if Julian had returned from war. The question remained with her. Not because she regretted her life, because some questions belonged to the heart even when they had no answer. Evelyn looked toward the manor windows, glowing in the evening darkness. She said she believed Julian would have wanted one thing above all else, that Ravenshade should remain a place where people were valued before they were judged. Edmund smiled, because he knew that was exactly what she had created. Not a monument to a family name, a living legacy. Years passed. The world outside Ravenshade continued changing. New inventions appeared. New ideas entered society. Old expectations slowly began to weaken, but inside the manor, one principle remained unchanged. No one who entered Ravenshade was treated as invisible. The servants remembered the woman who had once walked away from the estate with a single case. The villagers remembered the woman who had returned with compassion instead of bitterness. And the younger generations remembered the lesson written not in books, but in the life of Evelyn Ashcombe, that injustice could delay a person, it could wound them. It could convince the world that they had been defeated, but it could never decide the final chapter. On the anniversary of the night she was forced from the ballroom, Evelyn returned there alone. The candles were lit. The room was quiet. She stood beneath the chandelier once more, but this time there was no crowd waiting to judge her. No laughter, no whispers. No document raised against her, only the woman she had become. She placed Julian's old letter on the table for a moment and looked at the words that had once guided her through darkness. Then she closed the box. Not because she wanted to forget, because she no longer needed proof that she had survived. Her life was the proof. And in the years that followed, whenever the story of Ravenshade Manor was told, people did not begin with the false contract or the betrayal. They began with the woman who was told she had no place, and they ended with the woman who created one. Because the greatest victory was never forcing the world to open a door. It was discovering that even after every door closed, a person could still build a home of their own. And perhaps that was the lesson Ravenshade carried longer than any name written in its family records. Years after the great confrontation, a new generation walked through the manor halls without knowing how much pain those rooms had once witnessed. They saw only warmth. They saw only a household where servants were treated with respect, where visitors were welcomed without judgment, and where a woman's voice carried the same weight as any man's. But Evelyn remembered. She remembered because forgetting would have been easy. Forgetting would have allowed the past to become a distant story, instead of a truth that shaped everything she had built. One evening, as the last light faded over the gardens, Evelyn found a young maid standing near the library door holding a letter. The girl looked nervous. She apologized for interrupting and said she was uncertain whether someone like her should bring such a matter directly to the lady of the house. Evelyn smiled and invited her inside. The letter was from the daughter of a former Ravenshade servant, a woman who had once left the estate after losing her position and believed she had no path forward. Now she was asking whether there might be work available for her. Evelyn read the letter carefully. Then she placed it beside the old account books that had once revealed the family's hidden wrongdoing. The same room that had held secrets now held possibilities. She wrote the reply herself. Not a promise of charity, a promise of opportunity. When the maid carried the letter away, Evelyn remained in the library for a while longer. The fire burned softly. The shelves stood quietly around her. The room no longer represented betrayal. It represented everything that came after. Outside, the winter rain began to fall against the windows, just as it had on the night she left Ravenshade carrying only a small case. But the sound no longer reminded her of exile. It reminded her of how far she had traveled. The cold outside had once been a punishment. Now, it was simply weather, and the warmth inside was no longer something granted by others. It was something she had created. That was the final truth of Evelyn Ashcombe's story. Not that she defeated those who tried to destroy her, not that she reclaimed a title, not that she returned to the house that once rejected her, but that she became the kind of person who, even after losing everything, could still create something worth protecting. And within the walls of Ravenshade Manor, where a woman had once been told she did not belong, her legacy remained, a home built not from inheritance alone, a home built from courage, compassion, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to disappear.